This is a new format of video. I'll be creating many more of these in the coming weeks and months. It is for subscribers only, and it is the attempt to really create another format for people who are really focused on Ukraine stories to really dive into the detail. Now, I tend to watch around 3 or 4 hours of material in Russian a day. That is content created by fantastic Ukrainian journalists, but also there are a small number of Russian journalists in exile who are doing tremendous work. This new video format is designed to try and make some of this material available to my audience, and also, of course, to build the loyalty of the channel and to put it on a firm financial footing. I'm going to be upfront about it. I am going to be spending more time producing this content. In fact, I'm going to be devoting almost 100% of my time to creating content for the channel, creating content that focuses on what's happening in Russia, what's happening in Ukraine, and of course, for Ukrainian victory. And in this format, I will be translating and reading out some of the best materials that are available in Russian language. It is quite an intense effort to transcribe and then translate and turn that material into videos. That's why I need to spend a lot more time on this and why it's going to be made available on a subscription basis. But I hope to be able to do this and produce these stories within at least 12, 24 hours of them first appearing in the Russian original. So please like, subscribe, share, and of course, recommend to others that they join the channel to support the work we're doing. The first video in this series is going to be one created by the Russian journalist Michael Naki, and the title of it is How Putin Destroyed Luhansk. Now, Michael Naki is one of the most talented Russian journalists. He is vehemently opposed to Putin's regime, and he is extremely pro-Ukraine. In almost every video he creates, he also makes it clear that everything that Russia is doing in Ukraine is a war crime, and he makes it quite clear that we should have no sympathy for Russians who go to Ukraine to kill innocent civilians. He has a strongly principled stance, but above all, he produces journalism of the highest quality. He is a 30-year-old former radio personality of the now disbanded Echo Moskwy station. He hosts a YouTube channel with 1.4 million subscribers where he publishes daily reports on Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And here is, almost word for word, the episode that he produced on the 29th of May. Russian propaganda has been trying for 10 years to pretend that there was no Russian invasion of Donbass. That, in fact, a civil war took place in Ukraine 10 years ago, and the residents of Donbass simply wanted to secede. Apparently, they wanted independence from Kiev. The story goes that the bloody Kiev regime came and began to destroy Donbass in response. Russian propaganda uses the phrase, "Where have you been for the last 8 years?" This question was asked during the start of Russia's full-scale invasion 2 years ago and continues to be asked by Russian propagandists today. Where have you been is the implication for those 8 years while Ukraine bombed Donbass. In fact, Ukraine destroyed enemy troops that occupied its territory. In fact, there was no civil war in Ukraine. There was the Russian army. There were Russian representatives who came to Donbass and simply began to seize everything there, masquerading as some kind of local population, etc., etc. Over the course of 10 years, Donbass was transformed from a prosperous region that needed almost nothing into a garbage dump where shells rattle every day, where streets are literally turned into garbage dumps, where the stadium has been empty for a long time, and where people simply live not even like in the so-called terrible 90s, but far, far worse. Because various kinds of bandits who came from Moscow to create the insurgency, they constantly do nothing but divide the remaining fragments of Donbass that still exist. But it is important that you understand what happened there and can answer questions that may arise at some point from family, loved ones, friends, acquaintances who may be influenced by Russian propaganda, may have heard Russian propaganda narratives. 10 years ago, the so-called Luhansk and Donetsk republics separated from Ukraine. On May the 11th, and 14th, with the support of Russia, illegal referendums were held in the Donetsk and Luhansk regions of Ukraine, in which the majority allegedly supported the act of the Declaration of State Independence. And on May the 12th, both of these new formations declared state sovereignty and the war began. Not the civil war, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The referendum was preceded by more than 3 months of unrest, which was incited by Russian agents. A resident of Luhansk, writer Roman Merkulov, was an eyewitness to those events. He's published this important story, his memoirs of how it all happened, and a link to that will be contained in the description of the video. He says, when I first saw Luhansk in 1990, I only knew about the city that was previously called Voroshilovgrad. Having survived the Second World War by the mid-1970s, Luhansk had become a place of great hope. Large-scale construction was carried out with the expectation of significant population growth. It was expected that the regional capital would soon occupy the same position as Kharkiv and Donetsk. However, the crisis of the second half of the 1980s and the collapse of the USSR dashed those ambitious plans. The next 10 years became a period of real economic catastrophe for the region, the consequences of which largely determined the course of events in 2014. By this time, power in Donbass belonged to the Party of Regions. Its leadership was a mixture of former Communist Party members, Leninist Komsomol leaders, and members of organized crime. Experiencing the collapse of the USSR, industry, mines, and large private companies, one way or another, belonged to the Party of Regions. Such a monopoly inevitably gave rise to political hegemony. Representatives of small business could not even think about any competition when compared with the oligarchic capital. The small middle class was mainly represented by state employees, and having barely recovered from the shock of the 90s, the intelligentsia did not really play any significant role. The economic boom of the 2000s had a positive impact on the Luhansk region. Cities such as Anthracite, Rubezhny, and Ravenki still could not offer young people anything other than hard and low-paid work. An alternative was to travel to work in Russia. Ultimately, this led to the fact that a significant part of the population of the Luhansk region pinned their hopes for a better life not on distant Kiev, which actually handed over the Donbass to these local oligarchs, but on Rostov, Kuban, and the Stavropol territory. In turn, the Party of Regions jealously defended their patrimony from political competitors, having time after time resorted to populist rhetoric about closer ties with Russia. At the end of January 2014, middle-aged men wearing caps and carrying sticks appeared on the streets of Luhansk. Many of them looked like complete alcoholics. These were representatives of the so-called Luhansk Cossacks, a number of organizations, structures of which had a rather marginal existence on the regional periphery. Now they were needed by the Party of Regions, who called them to Luhansk to protect administrative facilities from possible attacks by Euromaidan activists. Attempts by the Cossacks to pretend to be patrolling, sometimes not too decisively, demanding documents from passers-by, then it caused more irritation than fear. But their appearance steadily came to make more of a dangerous impression. Simultaneously with the Cossacks, the Luhansk Guard is an openly pro-Russian movement, mostly consisting of disadvantaged youth of the Luhansk region. The Party of Regions hoped to use the Guards and the Cossacks to their advantage, but failed in both cases. We remember the first weeks after the flight of President Yanukovych as a relatively calm period. True, already on February the 22nd, near the regional administrative buildings in Luhansk, the first shootings were heard. But then it was accidental misfirings of pistols. It seemed that the scenario of 2004, 2005 was being repeated when the rather harsh rhetoric of official Kiev and Donbass gave way to a compromise that returned Yanukovych and his party of regions to the political plane. This time, however, Moscow was ready to act. Already on February the 28th, friends and colleagues noticed in the area of the bus station a group of people who were obviously in the city for the first time, speaking Russian without the characteristic Donbass accent. They went to the city centre, marveling at local prices and converting hryvnia into rubles. There were several dozen of them, and the next morning the first rally took place in Luhansk under openly separatist slogans of the so-called Russian Spring. Of course, without the participation of the Party of Regions, the Russians and pro-Russian separatists would not have been able to gather several thousand people, most of whom were brought to the center of Luhansk by bus in advance. But they played the role of an active governing minority that turned the regional front into a pro-Russian separatist movement. One March, the Russian tricolour soared above the regional administration, and the protesters who seized the building, in quotes, turned to Putin with a request to send troops to protect the region. It was not the budget extras which previously made up the absolute majority of these meetings, the alcoholics and the strays, nor its organizers from the Party of Regions who have gone along with this so far. Now everything changed. On March the 9th, a pro-Ukrainian rally was once again held in the Taras Shevchenko Central Park, the participants of which were not even for Euromaidan, but simply against pro-Russian separatism. Who were these people? Representatives of the middle-class intelligentsia, patriotic romantics, and those who hoped to get rid of the political monopoly of the Party of Regions? Of course, too many of them could not have gathered, but the anti-Maidan camp located across the road did not represent any kind of cross-section of the mood of the Luhansk region. But they had something else. That day, armed with clubs, bats, chains, and brass knuckles, the guards beat the unarmed, regardless of age, regardless of gender. What about the rest? They hoped for the state, but from Kiev only news came about an increase in utility tariffs and the abolition of the regional status of the Russian language, which a law which of course is used by Russian propagandists, which was never actually put into practice. The authorities seem to be playing with fire rather than dealing with the situation on the ground. The siege of Crimea that was taking place at that same time caused jubilation amongst the Luhansk separatists and seemed to force the government to act. After the beatings in Shevchenko Park, the Ukrainian security service detained several separatist leaders. However, there was very little practical benefit from this, and the notorious regional deputy Arsen Isayev and the leader of the Luhansk Guard, Alexander Kharitonov, were not independent political figures. Almost certainly they were being guided by Moscow. It was not possible to negotiate with these puppets, but only with their patrons and masters. But in March, the Party of Regions lost power over the anti-Maidan. Both formally and in fact, it came under the control of the Russians, who put forward the separatist slogans of the Russian Spring. For the Party of Regions, who'd been using the Donbass as leverage over Kiev for decades, this was a real disaster from which they never recovered. But the Russians also failed to win over the local elites, and in 2014 and later, they were forced to rely on outright fringe groups. Meanwhile, the marches of supporters of the Russian Spring became increasingly aggressive, one must assume on the orders of Moscow. The fighting near Slavyansk had not yet begun. The Odessa House of Trade Unions had not yet burnt down. And already on April the 5th, a warehouse with weapons for the newly formed army of the Southeast was discovered. armed with machine guns and grenade launchers of militants who began to accumulate in Luhansk and a number of regional cities. In response, on April the 6th, a crowd under Russian flags seized the building of the Regional Security Service of Ukraine. The attack was led by well-trained fighters, among whom stood out representatives of the Luhansk Society of Afghan Veterans. Although several policemen who had the misfortune of being in the outer security were injured during the assault, there was no real local resistance to the authorities. The building, along with the documents and weapons, was simply surrendered. Opposite the entrance, a camp of fighters against nationalism was set up, imitating the Kiev Maidan. I visited there on April the 7th, says the writer Roman Merkulov. Well-armed militias of the southeast remained in the building. Opposite, behind the hastily assembled fortifications, several hundred people were wandering aimlessly, mostly from Anthracite, Krasny Luch, and other depressed cities. There was a small group of representatives from Zaporizhia looking at hastily made posters with calls to fight against fascism and Zionism. The ultimatums of the separatists, who demanded they be carried out, also remained unanswered. Referendum on the creation of the Luhansk People's Republic and its accession to Russia. Interior Minister Arsen Avakov promised to stabilize the situation and inevitably squeeze out the paid marginals. He said that the gathering of separatists was cordoned off, but in Luhansk we saw this cordon. Several police cars parked at a discreet distance from the SBU building. Even with the challenges of the newly formed government in Kiev, which was also faced with Russia's hybrid aggression, without the initiative of the authorities in the capital, it still remained incomprehensible to us what was happening. However, in Luhansk, the situation with decisiveness was no better. The new governor, Mikhail Bolatsykh, was attacked by guards from the very beginning of his activities, and having encountered obstructions from the party of the regions, he actually withdrew. On May the 10th, the acting president of Ukraine, Alexander Turchinov, then a political ally of Yulia Tymoshenko, replaced Zabolotsky with the leader of Luhansk, Batkivshina, Irina Virigina. Thanks to the latter circumstances, I found myself surrounded by the governor as a lawyer for Tymoshenko's biased party as an employee of the Control and Audit Commission. My responsibilities consisted mainly of checking the reports of the regional branches of the party. The elections scheduled for the end of May were approaching, and Yulia Vladimirovna expected to compete for the presidency. So completely unwillingly, for almost a whole month, I found myself included in Virgin's retinue, first as a trusted emissary, and then as a member of the election headquarters. Could you have hoped for a better observation site? And there was something to watch. Igor Gherkin's detachment has already captured Slavyansk, starting real hostilities. But all this seemed to be very far still from Luhansk. On the morning of April the 16th, the day when the deadline for fulfilling the ultimatum put forward by the separatists expired, Luhansk residents were surprised to learn about the birth of the Federation of the Southeast and its interim president, Anatoly, the leader. Anatoly Mikhailovich, I knew him for many years, first as a friend of my father, later as my own leader. Why the former chairman of the Luhansk Court of Appeal needed to participate in this farce, I still don't know. I can only assume that this was one of the unrealized ideas of the notorious Kremlin towers to create political chaos in the southeast of Ukraine. One way or another, the president's video messages in quotes recorded in some garage only caused general bewilderment. Since Anatoly Mikhailovich did not take any other actions, they forgot about the Federation the very next day. Alas, the authorities were unable to get rid of the real separatists so easily. On April 21st, the people's governor, Valery Bolotov, was popularly elected by a people's assembly, or Bolotov was another Luhansk guardsman of Stakhanov, nominally leading the Army of the Southeast, whose first victory was the seizure of the regional administration of the SBU. What was the headquarters of the legal governor doing at this time? As an important matter, we organized the visit of Yulia Tymoshenko, who came to Luhansk on April the 24th for negotiations with Bolotov. In particular, the party leadership took measures to prevent rival Petro Poroshenko from entering Luhansk on the same day. She organized several hundred protesters blocking their exit from the airport. However, Pyotr Alexeyevich, as it was said, still broke into the city. The question is, was Tymoshenko hoping to achieve some kind of agreement with the puppet government hanging on a Russian string, or was she simply demonstrating her usual determination? I don't know. Yulia Vladimirovna boldly came to the separatist camp, but the negotiations failed. Of course, they couldn't. They couldn't succeed. Bolotov and the Russians behind them were no longer hiding, and this matter led to an armed conflict. On April the 27th, the creation of the Luhansk People's Republic was announced, and 2 days later, armed separatists seized the regional administration, the Ministry of Internal Affairs, local television studios, and began to disarm the internal troops and army units located in Luhansk. They scheduled a referendum on self-determination for May the 11th. By an amazing coincidence, other people of the Donbass in Donetsk at the same time experienced almost the same events and chose the same date. In those days, I traveled around the area a lot and noticed a gradual change. First of all, the patrol cars disappeared. After several attacks, the police disappeared into thin air. Instead, the first checkpoints appeared on the streets and roads, the militiamen standing on them with St. George's ribbons, diligently inspecting the cars and detaining anything they found suspicious. There was also shooting, and the first victims appeared. Of course, the activities of the separatists were not limited to setting up roadblocks and seizing administrative buildings. On the 14th, the Luhansk region was divided into a predominantly industrial south and a predominantly agricultural north. In the industrial cities of Rubezhny and Alchevsk, the army of the southeast easily found a source of reinforcements among the local proletariat. But north of Luhansk, the separatists had to resort to different tactics. In April, May, well-trained teams dispersed throughout the region to organize public gatherings. I remember how this happened. In Stanitsa Luganska, several buses with banners and symbols of the Russian Liberal Democratic Party, LDPR, television cameramen, sound equipment, and armed guards appeared. From the Army of the Southeast, the speaker gives an incendiary performance on a professionally equipped stage. Do you want to ask the Cossacks, the villagers, to manage the wealth of our soil ourselves? Yes, of course we wish to do that. The bars of people gathering, of extras who arrived by buses, and hundreds of other onlookers gathered in the central square at the height of the working day. It was a big crowd. Cameramen and photographers worked close up. In parallel with this, there was widespread. The scenario was that armed people burst into the regional offices and beat employees, often taking them away for investigation. The same thing happened with local social activists known for their pro-Ukrainian views. It was then that the infamous expression appeared, "Send them to the basements," that is, to the regional department of the SBU, where most of the prisoners were initially taken. Subsequently, there were a lot of such basements. In early May, the Luhansk stronghold of Batkivshina fell. It was captured by militants, one of whom, for some reason, was armed with a terrifying-looking grenade launcher. Soon after these events, the headquarters of the governor Verzhin moved to Svatova. At this time, Irina Konstantinova received information from her employees about the rapidly deteriorating situation, but by her own admission, she could not influence the situation. Kiev showed no visible interest in Luhansk, and there was no talk of any normal pre-election activities, and my trips around the region became increasingly risky. Entering Adar, I could not know in advance under whose control it was. Communicating with the militiamen stationed at the checkpoints required knowledge of psychology. Even the wrong music in the car could lead to arrest, and only the self-confidence of youth allowed me to neglect the dangers. Of course, it was stupid. Shooting was heard every now and then on the roads. Once I missed a detachment of militias by just half an hour, who mistook a civilian car for an advancing enemy. In this battle, the wife and child of a young doctor of my wife's colleague were killed by a stray bullet. On May 25th, presidential elections were held in Ukraine, won by Petro Poroshenko. In our Svatova, I went home, happily passing through the checkpoints of Cossacks, militias, and one criminal authority whose people seized the bridge and imposed tribute on trucks traveling to Luhansk. Of course, they also fought for the people of Donbass. The atmosphere in Luhansk was oppressive. After the so-called referendum on May the 11th, the separatists finally abandoned all pretenses. The referendum itself, of course, had nothing to do either with Ukrainian law or the real expression of the will of the people. Of course, the result was not off by just several hundred. I don't know either the turnout figures or the number of votes actually cast for the People's Republic, but there are a couple of pieces of evidence that point towards the truth. One of my acquaintances, a staunch supporter of the Russian Spring, went to the polling station with the passports of his relatives to support the young republic. And the former activist of the Party of Regions acted more decisively and allegedly voted on all the voter lists that she had on their behalf. One way or another, an active minority existed, but supported by violence. Of course, these people did not vote for the already established reign of terror of all kinds of local bosses and thugs, but for the peaceful entry of the region into Russia. But they got exactly the first thing. On the streets, militants stopped the cars and they enjoyed shooting, immediately liquidating people in the name of the LPR armed forces. Those who tried to argue without further ado were sent to the basement, and from there, not everyone returned. Denunciations became commonplace. Neighbors settled scores with neighbors, and even people far from public politics ended up in the basement. The owner of the gym, a former Afghan, in conversation with a visitor, was skeptical about Bulatov's stated prospect of turning Luhansk into a little Switzerland. Detentions, beatings, ransom. One history professor had the impudence to publicly dissociate himself from the new government, and he spent the next few months under arrest as he was kindly informed by an investigator who introduced himself as an FSB officer. A well-known radio presenter in Luhansk, the militant simply killed her husband, accusing him of sympathies with the Kiev junta. The couple kept several dogs. The militia killed them. Prisons were opened. Convicted of murdering his own mother, a drug addict celebrated his wedding by noisily moving into someone else's house with his young bride. He could now afford it. An ordinary commander of Novorossiya who grew up on the same street as me, but who was he? Who is he? People with no name at all suddenly achieved some kind of status. For example, former policeman and sadist Alexander Bednov was housed in the central buildings of my alma mater, the Vladimir Dal Eastern Ukrainian National University. The bandits turned it into a dungeon where they engaged in execution and torture. Bednov was not alone. The life of the new Red Guard was controlled by the semi-literate chieftain Sergei Gor. Control over Stakhanov was established by the hysterical Cossack general Pavel Dremov, and Lysychansk was ruled by Alexei Mozgovy, who was born under Che Guevara. They might have seemed like cosmic characters if they had failed to seize power. They succeeded due to the fact that during the entire Russian Spring, neither Bolotov nor his henchmen encountered resistance from those who swore an oath to protect the people of Ukraine from armed bandits. It's unknown what prevented Kiev from somehow coordinating the police, the internal troops and army units located in Luhansk and the region, but in the end, each piglet waited for the grey wolf on its own, without any interaction with the rest of the power structure. Therefore, they were captured with extraordinary ease after several shots in the air. Only once in Luhansk did Bolotov meet with resistance. On the 2nd of June, border guards stationed in the Mirny quarter opened fire back at the militants. Then the militia hit hard, and Kiev, which didn't know what to do, left the scene. During the day, aircraft fly aimlessly over Luhansk. One of the planes apparently struck the former regional administration, killing the LPR health minister. All in quotes. It was all both stupid and senseless, but it provided Russian propaganda with excellent material. How about missiles and peaceful protests? By the beginning of summer, there were already quite a lot of Russians in Luhansk, among whom natives of the Caucasus stood out noticeably. The militia suddenly had armored vehicles and artillery. Not far from our house, there was an infantry fighting vehicle which, on the 1st of June, shot at a bus passing by. A bystander was killed and a passenger lost her hand. The girl worked as a pediatrician in one of the city hospitals. It is unknown what the crew of the combat vehicle imagined they were doing. Those were days when Ukrainian paratroopers surrounded at Luhansk airport were still holding out. There were incidents similar to this, but one by one they were all dismissed. Bolotov said that in the summer of 2014, Luhansk was shelled by the Zarya battalion, which was then commanded by Igor Plagnidsky, who later took the place of the leader of the LPR. These words were then confirmed by several other retired members of the People's Militia, after which Bolotov died suddenly. In this regard, the following incident comes to mind. One day I found myself close to a series of explosions that occurred in the area of the bus station. Less than a few minutes later, a Russian television crew appeared at the scene of the shelling, and they immediately got to work. There were some journalistic successes. In July, the city was almost deserted. On the streets, there were frightened pets and rare pedestrians, listening to the sound of shooting. Mostly militiamen moved in cars and sometimes columns of armed vehicles through the streets, with soldiers sitting in them dressed in identical uniforms without stripes. Where could they have come from? Certainly not from miners and tractor drivers. Our world has narrowed. It's become incredibly simple. It was necessary to get food, collect a first aid kit, and stock up on water. A call I got from a journalist from Kiev radio, which had been created in those July days, sounded to me like it came from another planet. After listening to my confused story, she asked, "Why don't people go out to protest?" And really, why? The author asks a question, hinting at the columns of armed vehicles and people with weapons that were everywhere. What you've heard there is a story through the eyes of an eyewitness. What happened then? Taking advantage of the fact that as soon as the new government came, as soon as Yanukovych was kicked out, Russia, through its agents, both directly in the Donetsk and Luhansk regions, and those who came there sent directly from Russia, literally seized power and started a war, giving new power to local thugs and hooligans, but at the same time coordinating their efforts, supplying them with weapons, providing them with equipment, providing them with instructions on what to do and when and how to do it. Russian propaganda worked massively, drawing pictures of the atrocities of the Kiev regime, as they had already started calling them, which in fact were just the atrocities of the pseudo-militia that they had empowered. Why do I say pseudo-militia? The militias fight for freedom. The militias fight against dictatorship. These same people fought for Russian banditry. As a result, Luhansk, Donetsk, and the Luhansk and Donetsk regions turned from just economically developing cities into a haven of banditry. Then the next 8 to 10 years, if you count now, many Russian bandits came there. Those same types of bandits who might have been part of the Wagner group and after it was disbanded knew too much. Strelkov was in prison, and the Wagner group, which destroyed the militia, was eventually also beheaded. Yevgeny Prigozhin was killed by Vladimir Putin, who blew up his plane. Of course, one can hardly blame the people who gained power as a result of the Maidan that they could not coordinate too quickly, that they could not pay the necessary attention to Donbass and Luhansk, that they missed the opportunity to resist, that the local police were literally caught with their trousers down, that no one fulfilled their oath, that no one stepped in to stop these bandits in time, and that people who were unaware that by supporting independence of the region were actually supporting Russia and the kind of banditry that then became the norm. Of course, this is all true. Moreover, the fact that Donbass was under the thumb of, let's say, all sorts of bad people, and the fact that it began to turn towards Russia, there were actually periodically pro-Russian views there, of course, and one can say in part that it was the fault of the previous government for not creating opportunities in the region. But it was Russia that started the hybrid warfare and then directly invaded these territories. Russia started a war there and started killing people. Just imagine what you saw. You live in a city. At some point, some local authorities and visiting freaks seize the buildings. They establish their own rules, take away cars, kill pedestrians, deprive them of their hands. What the hell is going on? This is what Russia did back then, even 10 years ago. Therefore, when they tell you that it was some kind of self-determination, that with passion how Donbass wanted to go back to Russia, that in fact these people were oppressed and had now been liberated from that oppression, well, you will know that this has absolutely nothing to do with what is being claimed. Nothing to do with reality. Yes, the local authorities and the Ukrainian authorities made multiple mistakes, those who replaced Yanukovych, but nevertheless, it was Russia that attacked this territory and made it simply a haven of chaos, just some kind of territory of banditry. Everyone who could leave left, and everyone who couldn't was mobilized by Russia. In 2022, the entire male population was sent by Russia to wage war against their fellow citizens. You see, this is about the question of what goals Russia has, what Russia is actually doing. Russian Spring is not when Russia comes into a city, changes the flags to tricolors, and says, that's it, you are home, do you speak Russian now? No, the Russian Spring is when Russians come, destroy a city, give power to thugs and bandits, suck out the resources, and then send the people to die further outside of their territories for the sake of their interests, not the people's interests. And if Russia manages to continue its aggression, if Russia is not stopped, this will await even more cities, not only in Ukraine, but also in neighbors, Kazakhstan, Georgia, Moldova, then the Baltic countries, and the European ones. A dictator never stops until he is stopped. It is impossible to appease an aggressor. And the biggest mistake of the West was that since 2008, maybe before, and even now, they do not have a full understanding of what is happening. But since 2008, over and over again, the West has allowed the dictator to seize more and more territory with practically no credit for it, with practically no checks and no impunity, no punishment for what is happening. Aggression and dictators can only be stopped. I hope this will be done. Ukraine is doing everything possible for this. All that remains is for the West to help. So, dear audience, please help fight propaganda, because Russian propaganda, especially for Western audiences, and it must be said periodically for Ukrainian audiences, works far too well. And we need to do everything possible to stop it from working, since this is one of Russia's few chances to break out of dictatorship. Ukrainian victory is the only way to end dictatorship in Russia. It's through propaganda, through demoralizing Ukraine, Ukrainian troops, Ukrainian citizens, demoralize them so that they will not continue to fight for their lives, but so that they surrender to the mercy of the winner and become future cannon fodder for subsequent Russian military actions. This is a translation of a video created by Michael Naki. If you like this, please add a comment. Let me know what more you want to hear from this new format of subscriber content. I'll be adding more in here too, and we'll also be running Q&A sessions for you to participate. But I would love to hear whether you find this useful and want to consume more of this content.